This is Hayley Glaholt, and I will be hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, there's a few things. For participants listening in French, click on Floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on Documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right. There will be a question and answer during the last 5 minutes of this webinar. To submit your question, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on Messaging and then Participants, and type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time, and at the end I'll scroll through them and read them out. If you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. So that's it for housekeeping. We'll now begin our discussion. So hello again, my name is Hayley Glaholt, and I am the co-founder and executive director of a nonprofit in Toronto called Link Coalition Toronto. Thank you so much to Boost CYIC for having me here today. I'm looking forward to giving out some information on pets and family violence, and specifically what is the link between those things. So I'm going to begin by going back in time a little bit here to 2005 and Hurricane Katrina. So the photos you're seeing here might be familiar to you. You might remember have seen things like this in the news around that time. And the reason I'm showing these to you is that Hurricane Katrina was sort of an interesting turning point in terms of how the public and how the government thinks about the human-animal bond. So in addition to the human suffering that was caused by Hurricane Katrina, there was also quite a bit of suffering to animals. And an interesting article came out in 2015, and it was called How Hurricane Katrina Turned Pets into People. And the point of this article, it profiles many different people, but one of the people it profiles is a man, an older man. He was 70 years old, and it interviewed him about his experience in Hurricane Katrina. And he talks about how when the rescuers came to get him, his little dog, an apricot mini poodle, I think, he had put her on the roof of his house while he grabbed onto a tree to try and survive. When the rescuers came, they said, "We can take you, but we're not in the dog business." That's what they said to him. And an important quote comes after this. He said, "Had I known she couldn't come with me, I would have stayed." And that's just something I want you to bear in mind as we go through this webinar, because it really does speak to the power of the human-animal bond. So during Hurricane Katrina, estimates are around between 100 and 250,000 pets were left behind, and approximately 70,000 of those pets died. And what this led to was actually pretty interesting. So Congress in the States was flooded by letters after Hurricane Katrina. And essentially it was people talking about the horrific choice they had to make between saving themselves and saving their animals. Many people stayed behind because of their animals, and many people weren't able to. What this led to, what all these letters, this letter campaign led to, was the Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act, the PETS Act in the States. And essentially what this says now is that rescue organizations, rescue agencies must save pets as well as people during natural disasters. So again, this is what we can kind of learn from this is that people are willing to put themselves at risk. They're willing to stay in situations that are risky and potentially dangerous in order to protect their animals, their pets. So if you take a look here, this was a survey, I believe it was conducted by the American Veterinary Medical Association. And they did a survey asking people, what do you consider your pets to be? So some of you may know that under the eyes of the law, pets are property, but that's not at all the kind of response we're seeing from people who are interviewed about their pets. So as you can see here, most people would say that their pets are a family member. 80% would say that. 7% would say pets are their best friend, and 13% would say that pets are equivalent to children. So that doesn't at all reflect what the law is saying about what pets are. Pets are, again, property. And then if we look here at some headlines I've pulled over the past few years, we can see that in the eyes of the law, things are actually sort of starting to change. So in my daily life, I'm a family mediator. So I work with families that are separating. And even in family mediation, I've done mediations about who gets sort of custody and access of the pet once the relationship is over. So that is sort of a more mediation, slightly more informal than the court process, because as you can see by these headlines, things are beginning to change a little bit, right, in terms of how family law, at least, or property law sees the relationship of people and their pets. So this brings us, when we think about the changing and the shifting position of pets and families, and somewhat in the eyes of the law, it becomes clear that pets are, for many people, a significant part of the family system. So then when we're serving families, when we're working with families, working with children, and when we're trying to understand family violence, we need to make room for this relationship between people and their pets. And obviously I'm going to go into this in more detail throughout this presentation, but that's sort of the key idea here, that we need to take this relationship seriously. We need to take cruelty towards animals seriously if we do want to work with families that are experiencing crisis and violence. So the main idea that the main body of research that these ideas are grounded in is called the link research. So this is primarily out of the States, this body of research, and there's an organization called the National Link Coalition in the United States, and it's run by a man named Phil Arkow. And he nicely summarizes what the link literature is. So he says, as you can see here, when animals are abused, people are at risk, and when people are abused, animals are at risk. And the main idea that he's saying is that there's a significant correlation between 4 types of family violence: domestic violence, animal abuse, child abuse, and elder abuse. And in short, where one of these forms of family violence is present, other forms are often present as well. So in other words, the presence of one of these forms of violence is usually just the tip of the iceberg. So in your work, you may primarily work with child maltreatment, child abuse. And what I'm trying to emphasize today is that it's important to look at the other forms of abuse, the other types of violence that may be occurring in the family, to get a bigger, more holistic picture of what's actually going on in the family. So, and this is why at our organization, at Link Coalition Toronto, this is why it's so important for us to do cross trainings such as these. So we work with veterinarians, teaching them how to look out for signs of domestic violence in their clients, as well as animal abuse in their animal clients. We also work with lawyers, with family mediators, and with domestic violence professionals, encouraging them to keep their eyes open for other types of abuse or violence that might be occurring in the home. Because again, the more you know, the more powerful it is. So today I'm going to mainly focus on child abuse and animal abuse and how that relates to, child abuse and domestic violence, and the role that animal abuse plays in those types of violence. I'm going to begin by briefly looking at pets and intimate partner violence. So the quote I have on this slide here, I think nicely summarizes the ways that abusers will use animals as part of their campaign for control over and coercion over their victims. And this quote is by Carol J. Adams. She's a a very sort of forward-thinking feminist scholar out of the States. And she was actually way ahead of the curve. So you can see this quote is from 1995. She was actually way ahead of the curve in terms of identifying and taking seriously the way that abusers use pets to control primarily female victims. But as you know, I mean, domestic violence is in LGBT communities. Men can be victims of domestic violence as well. But she was very early on to identify this important connection. And in her mind as well, and as in many scholars' minds, there's a co-occurrence of the oppression of women and the oppression of animals. But that's sort of a discussion for another day. But as you can see in this quote, I'm going to read it just to sort of elucidate it a bit more. She says, by abusing animals, perpetrators are able to demonstrate their power, teach submission, isolate a woman from a network of support, express rage at self-determined action by women and children, perpetuate the context of terror, launch a preemptive strike against a woman leaving, punish and terrorize by stalking and executing an animal, force her to be involved in the abuse, and confirm their power. So in my own work with Link Coalition Toronto, which I'm going to get into at the end of this presentation, I can say from experience that the clients we work with have told us that their abusers have used all of these tactics in trying to keep the women in the home, keep the women from not saying that they're being abused. If the woman does leave, this is a way to get her back into the home if the animal is left behind. So I do find that this quote is a good summary of the many different ways abusers can use animals. So this is one example from a client of ours. We've changed many of the details, but this is an example of a client of ours, just so you can see how in practice abuser would use an animal. So she says, I've just left an abusive relationship and I'm staying with a friend. However, as I was leaving, my abuser refused to allow me to bring my pet. It was a choice between bringing my cat, who I love with all my heart, or photos of my son who passed away, as he wouldn't let me have both. When I tried to take the cat, he threw my things into the hallway and took my keys, locking me out of the apartment. He's now threatened to get rid of the cat, and I am unsure if he will act on this. I don't know what to do in terms of this, but this animal has been my emotional support through my son's death and many other difficult times. So this example is one of the, I wanted to give you an example that was sort of one of the lesser traumatizing examples I could give you. But as you can see here, this just is kind of, again, the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going on in that home. And this will give you an idea of what this might look like in practice with your own clients, right? So pets and child abuse is another sort of key area that perpetrators will use to control victims, to silence victims, and to keep victims within the home. So I'm going to begin the discussion of pets and child abuse by going back in time a little bit. So I'm going to take you back to the 1870s in England and the United States and Canada. And the 1970s, this is the Victorian era, this is a really interesting time in terms of the growth of the humane movement. So during this time, humane societies were starting to sort of pop up in cities and towns in Victorian England, in the States, and in Canada. So on your screen here, you'll see a picture of Mary Ellen McCormick. She was a little girl in New York. And it came to the attention of the police and other people around her that she was experiencing severe abuse at the hands of her adopted mother. And people involved in the case noted that the physical scars from this abuse were some of the most severe they had seen. And you can see in this photo on her legs, you see some of them, and on her face, you see some of them. What's notable about this case is that in 1874, there was no real way to bring the abusive mother to be accountable for the cruelty she'd inflicted on Mary Ellen. So what had to happen was that Henry Bergh, who was who had founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, people had to bring Mary Ellen's case to the ASPCA in order to get justice for her. So through the work of that organization, they were able to remove her from the home. And eventually, I do believe she was able to be moved to a different home or to a society after that. But the interesting thing out of this is that her case led Henry Bergh to found the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. So conceptually, there's a very close link between treating animals humanely and treating children humanely. They grew out of the same movement. And in Ontario, at least, the OSPCA, the Ontario Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was originally intended to protect the welfare of both children and animals. And it wasn't until several years later that the Children's Aid Society was formed as a separate organization. And the OSPCA began to primarily investigate animal cruelty. So again, conceptually, the welfare of children and animals has been linked since the Victorian era. There's also another way in which children and animals have been linked, and that brings us to the lower part of this slide here. This is an imprint made by William Hogarth in 1751 called The Four Stages of Cruelty. So this print was made as a form of education for the lower classes. They were primarily illiterate, so visuals were how sort of moral education was transmitted back then. So as you can see on the far left, I know it's pretty small, so you might not actually be able to see this, but on the far left, we see a young Nero. The character that this follows is Tom Nero. So all four of these photos are photos of Tom Nero throughout stages in his life. So the first one is Tom Nero as a young boy. And in this photo, he's torturing a dog, which is hard to see, but you probably don't actually want to see it anyway. So stage one is Nero torturing a dog. Stage two, the next one over, is an adult Tom Nero being abusive towards an animal. You can see him with a raised piece of wood, and he's hitting the horse with it. Stage three, he moves on to murdering a woman, which the title of that print is called Cruelty in Perfection. And stage four, called The Reward of Cruelty, is Nero himself being executed and then experimented on by physicians in the time. So these are quite gruesome, but this, which was not unusual for 1751. But the important thing to see here is that we have an early example of someone recognizing the connection between a child abusing animals or a child witnessing animal abuse and that person later on becoming abusive themselves. This sort of brings us to our next idea, which is that this is an intergenerational cycle of violence. And I'm sure that concept is not new to you. In the work you do, I'm sure you all know that violence is cyclical. But pointing out the role that child abuse might play in that cycle of violence is important to highlight. So if we go here in the sort of middle left, children are exposed to domestic violence and animal abuse. If children aren't able to be removed from that situation, or if that abuse if there's not a way to stop that, children themselves can grow up to be violent. As we saw in Tom Nero in 1751, that person then can go on to become a domestic violence batterer. Another animal is threatened or harmed in the home as part of this cycle of domestic violence. And then by harming or threatening that animal, the perpetrator is able to get their victims to stay in the home, which again, if these people stay in the home, then more children are exposed to animal cruelty and to domestic violence themselves. So not only is this an intergenerational cycle of violence, this is also something that, in terms of the psychological development of children, as again I'm sure you know, is quite significant. So some studies show that children will engage in cruelty towards animals or torture of animals because it's a way for them to exert power and control in a situation in which they are constantly overpowered and controlled by an abusive person in the home. Other children will engage in cruelty because in their family it's become normalized. So in some respects, they might not even know what's wrong because they see a parent or a sibling doing this regularly, and it has become the norm in their family. So there's a few, I didn't want to overwhelm you with statistics, but there's some important statistics here that I think will illustrate the significance and the severity of this issue. So the first one, these are pulled from a number of different sources, but the first one saying that cruelty to animals is one of the earliest symptoms of conduct disorder, usually showing up around the age of 6.5. Also, children who abuse animals are 2 to 3 times more likely to have been abused themselves. So again, children acting abusively towards animals it's sort of a light bulb moment, right? And it indicates to us as those who work with families that there could be much more going on. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there could be much more going on in that home. Sexually abused children are 5 times more likely to abuse animals. So again, that kind of points you in a certain direction in terms of what might be going on in the home. Childhood witnessing of animal cruelty results in significantly more risk of adolescent or interpersonal violence, again, cyclical violence. And this next point I'll talk about again in the next slide, 62 to 76% of animal abuse in the home occurs in the presence of children. So this is a very important statistic to think about when we think of adverse childhood experiences. So Barbara Boat, she works with the National Center for the Prosecution of Child Abuse in the States. There's a really great paper she's put out, which perhaps I can send out or give to Pearl to send out to you. She has some really interesting research, some in-depth research on the effect of child abuse on children as they grow up. So here she says, if witnessing intimate partner violence and experiencing other forms of violence and abuse is potentially toxic to the health of the child's brain, the cost to the child may be even greater when violence towards a family pet is added. So we can think for a minute about why for a child, why would the cost to the child be even greater if violence is perpetrated on the pet? And I think if any of you grew up with animals, or I mean, you work with children, I'm sure you've had conversations about the significance of pets in their lives. Oftentimes for children, the bond they have with their pet is the most intimate, the most trusting, the most comforting one they have in their entire life, in their home. So in that way, harm towards that pet and harm towards that bond is particularly traumatizing for the animal because it could be their only stable, comforting relationship. Also, children may have been told by their abusive parent, by others, even by people in positions of power, even the police, that violence towards an animal doesn't matter. And because animal cruelty is often not taken seriously by police and by other investigating bodies, this can be very confusing for a child, because to a child, they are completely traumatized and upset by the abuse they're seeing towards their pet. But if they don't see that concern reflected back to them, it can be very confusing and stressful for them. And lastly, if others normalize violence towards animals, some children may not feel entitled to their reactions and to their feelings of sadness. Again, so if people in the home are not saying that animal abuse is wrong, children themselves may not understand their own feelings and may not feel they're reacting appropriately to that abuse. So in the States and perhaps in Canada, the National Link Coalition is really pushing to have animal abuse or witnessing animal abuse categorized as an adverse childhood childhood experience. So you can see here, again, Phil Arco from the National Link Coalition says, we should treat childhood exposure to animal abuse as an adverse childhood experience that creates toxic stress, harms the child's developing brain architecture, desensitizes the child to violence, and leads to long-term hyper-responsiveness to perceived threats and lifelong health concerns. So I think that quote does a nice job summarizing what exactly on a physiological level, a social level, a psychological level, what witnessing animal abuse might do to a child. I'm just going to check the time really quick. Okay, good. So I've talked a lot about some of the bad news, but I'm going to shift now to talk about what's possible. What can we do about this? And the work that all of you do with children, with police, with families is vital for addressing the problem here. So I'm going to start by talking about a program that we run in Toronto, and there's other programs like this throughout the country and throughout North America. But as sort of an entree into that, I want to bring you back to an example from 2017. So some of you may remember hearing about this case in the news. So in 2017, a puppy was found in a Las Vegas airport, and he had a note with him. There's a picture of the note there, but I'm going to read out what it says to you. It says, "Hi, I'm Chewy. My owner was in an abusive relationship and couldn't afford me to get on the flight. She didn't want to leave me with all her heart, but she has no other option. My ex-boyfriend kicked my dog, and when we were fighting, and he has a big knot on his head. He probably needs a vet. I love Chewy so much. Please love and take care of him." And on the left, you'll see, so this identifies clearly that there's a need that survivors of domestic violence have to have options for what to do with their pets when they're experiencing violence. So many women will not leave their abuser if they can't bring their pet with them to safety. And the reason this is a problem is, as I said earlier, abusers know that this bond is important. So they will use that animal as a way to lure the victim back into the home. So I've heard many examples of women who have found the courage and the ability to leave their abusive partner. He will send them pictures of what he's done to the animals, what he's about to do to their pets, as a way to bring them back into the home. And many women will return. Also, another consequence we see here, again, Barbara Boat saying, children can be very worried when a pet is left behind, adding to their fears that they too may be abandoned. So the consequences of leaving a pet behind in an abuser's hands are kind of multifaceted, let alone the experience that the pet itself might experience at the hands of that abuser. So I have a few statistics. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's been some very good research done in Canada by a woman named Amy Fitzgerald at the University of Windsor. And she studied women across Canada in violence against women shelters, and it showed that 89% of the abused women in these shelters reported animal maltreatment in the home. And 2/3 said that witnessing that animal cruelty had a strong impact on their decision to leave their abuser. 60%, however, left their pets with their abuser when they found safety themselves. So why is it that women and other survivors of intimate partner violence are leaving their pets with their abuser? Well, at least in Toronto, no violence against women shelters will accept pets. That's changing slowly. North York Women's Shelter is going to start accepting them soon. But many women and many shelters do not accept these pets. So many women will not go to the shelters if they don't have that option. Oftentimes, too, there's a lack of affordable rental accommodation for people to go to with pets. Boarding facilities are very expensive. Kennels are very expensive. A lot of clients fear that if they take their animal to a humane society or an animal control facility, that their pet will be euthanized or not returned to them. There's also logistical problems to bringing your animal with you. Some abusers will abuse farm animals, will abuse very large animals that are difficult to actually transport. So that's something to consider as well. So from that, at least in Toronto, we've come up with a solution. We call it the SafePet program. But there's generally 3 models that people have come up with when trying to address this problem of people trying to leave their abuser but having nowhere to go because of their pets. So the first option is the co-sheltering option. This is something, again, that North York Women's Shelter in Toronto is starting to do, and other shelters throughout the country might already do this or might be starting to do this. So in the co-sheltering model, shelters will allow survivors to come to the shelter with their animals. They can either keep the animal in the room with them or in an indoor or outdoor kennel. Some use a heated garage or a basement. Bethesda House in Durham, I know this is very Ontario-centric, but Bethesda House in Durham allows this, and again, North York Women's Shelter in Toronto. A second option is boarding. So some veterinarians, some kennels, some groomers will allow people to board their animals at their facilities while those people go to get services of their own. This one is less frequently used, I would say, because it is very costly to house animals, and from a business perspective, it doesn't always make sense for veterinarians or kennels to do this. Also, a lot of veterinarians and kennels are concerned that women won't come back to get their pet, and then they're not sure what to do with the pet if that happens. A third option, and this is the option that in Toronto we use this fostering model. So we provide, we have a long list of fosters, and we provide short and long-term options for those who want to use our services. SafePet Ottawa also does this. And we're also expanding our program. We're trying to expand it throughout Ontario so that survivors of intimate partner violence across the province have an option. So we have a very rigorous screening protocol for our fosters. We hold on to pets for up to a year. And the conditions for using our program are simply that they need a referral from either a shelter, a caseworker, doctor, police officer, anything like that, confirming that they have experienced domestic violence. And after that, they can let us know what type of animal they have, and we try and accommodate them. So the slide is sort of a little bit messed up here, but you can kind of see that ours is a fairly straightforward model. So the survivor, once we've approved them to use our program, the survivor will drop her pet off at a confidential location, which is generally a veterinarian's office. And then our foster will go to the veterinarian's office to pick up that animal. So it's important to us that the survivor and the foster never meet, so that there's complete confidentiality and there's always safety maintained. We're very rigorous about those protocols. The flip side of this is when the survivor is ready to have her animal returned to her, she can let us know, and generally within 24 hours, we're able to return, the foster will return the pet to the vet, and then the survivor will come pick up her pet at the veterinarian's office. So I'm going to sort of end this. I'm just going to look, it's 1:30, so there's a few slides left, and I'm going to end this by talking about best practices. So in terms of what can we do to address the link and these 4 types of family violence in the clients and in the families we work with. So the first one is fairly obvious, but it's one of the most important. So it's important to ask clients about animal abuse and to start the conversation. So when working, so in family mediation, I often work with lawyers, with children's aid professionals, and one of the things I've heard is that they often don't ask about animals in the home. And one person, I remember her saying to me that first when she goes into a home, the first thing she'll do is ask the clients to put the animal sort of in the bathroom or keep it away just so it doesn't interfere. And after hearing our presentation, she sort of had an aha moment and thought to herself, that's kind of the last thing I should be doing. I should be inviting this animal out so I can take a good look at it. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but essentially here, we're suggesting that you include questions about the presence of animals, the welfare of animals, the turnover of pets in the household. So are animals coming and going? Are they disappearing in the household? Ask about these sorts of things in your intakes, in your referrals, in your assessments, and in your treatment plans. Also, you might have already experienced this, but children are often much more likely to open up about the treatment of their animals and the well-being of their animals than they are about themselves or about their parents. So for many people, that's a useful kind of entree into building rapport with the client, with a child client, and trying to understand their world a little bit better. So in one of the papers that I'd like to send out to you, I believe it's the Barbara Boat paper, she comes up with some useful suggestions here for questions you might use with your clients. So do you or have you ever had a favorite or a special pet? Was there ever a time when you were upset and your pet was a source of comfort to you? So that's a nice question because it can open the door to talking about what upset that child in the first place, what kind of things were they witnessing or hearing that were upsetting, and also you can get to the value of that pet for the child, and then maybe begin a conversation about how that bond was, used to harm the child. Also, do you or did you ever worry about bad things happening to your pet? And how is your taught pet to be good? And I find that's a very interesting question because then you can, it's sort of, there's no value attached to that. So a child won't feel they're being sort of interrogated by that. But it might give you a sense of how adults or older siblings in the household use physical methods or emotional methods to keep people or animals in control. And obviously after that, you would want to follow up with, okay, tell me more about that, and sort of empathetically and actively listening to the responses. The second one is closely related, and that's for looking for signs of animal abuse when you're doing home visits and when you're in the presence of the family and the animal if it happens to be there. Ask to see family pets and look at their condition. Are there mats in their fur? Do they look like they're well taken care of? Are there any obvious bruises? Are they limping? Are they fearful? So the photo I have there, that's a good photo of animal behavior, right? So a dog that's afraid is going to put its ear back, is going to hunch, is going to sort of walk away from you. Generally speaking, a confident, well-treated animal will not behave that way, right? A confident, well-treated animal will generally be friendly. So again, these are sort of smaller things to look at, and you don't even have to be overt about it. You don't have to specifically ask to see the family pet. You can just take a look around. Don't ask them to put it away if the animal's walking around, and just sort of subtly take a good look at it, because again, this might point you in the direction of additional things that are going on in that home. And also just a reminder that evidence of animal cruelty can be used to help you build your case if there's other forms of violence in the home. The third one is an important one. So one of the reasons we do these presentations is to encourage people to take animal cruelty seriously, not only because animal cruelty is a problem in of itself for animals, but because of the fuel it adds to a cruel environment, a violent environment, a disturbing environment for children and for other survivors within the household. So part of taking animal cruelty seriously means reporting animal cruelty when you see it. And we are on Link Coalition Toronto is on a committee with the Toronto Police, Domestic Violence Advisory Committee, and part of the reason we're on that is to educate police about the fact that animal cruelty ought to be taken seriously and investigated. So part of what this means is establishing lines of communication with local animal protection agencies, with shelters, with other sort of local bodies that might be responsible for investigating animal abuse, and obviously the police are a part of that. But also for those of you in Ontario, at least, you might have heard of recent changes to how animal cruelty is investigated. The new number, the sort of main number that you call, I've listed here, because the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act came into force on January 1st, 2020. And that's sort of the new place rather than the OSPCA. This is the new place that you report animal cruelty. So it's interesting because when police and when domestic violence workers, when child abuse workers, when everyone comes together, you'll often notice that the homes that are being reported for animal cruelty are the same homes that children's aid workers are visiting often, that police are showing up for domestic incidents. These things, again, tend to co-occur. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And the two sort of last ones I would talk about are the idea that it is important to take seriously and to respect the human-animal bond. So we've noticed in our work with survivors of domestic violence that many of the survivors are embarrassed to say that the reason they stayed is because of their pets. We've had clients that have children and have pets and that have stayed in an abusive environment longer than they would have liked to because they had nowhere to bring their pets and because they didn't want to leave their pet alone with their abuser. Now, most of these women and have ended up leaving, but they significantly delayed their leaving because of this sort of conundrum they are in. And we found that a lot of clients, again, are very embarrassed to say that to people. They're embarrassed to say that to police because they don't think that police will take that relationship seriously. We find this is particularly the case for older clients who either have children who have left the home or who don't have children at all. For them, the bond they have with their pet is extremely emotionally valuable to them. And for that reason, the idea of leaving their pet behind with their abuser is really out of the question for many of them. But again, it can be very embarrassing for them to say that if they feel that they're going to be kind of humiliated by revealing that or chastised for keeping themselves in a dangerous environment because of their pet. Again, you probably already know this in your own work, but it's good to be sort of gentle but persistent when asking people about their pets because they may be embarrassed to reveal what's really going on. They may not think you take it seriously, but if you gently but persistently ask about it, you might find out more information about that. And lastly, one of the most important things for us is to spread the word. So again, the reason we do these webinars and trainings is that we want different sectors, different silos to work together. So what that means is that when children's aid or child protection workers are in the home, keep your eyes out for animal abuse, for elder abuse, for signs of domestic violence. Similarly, when animal control professionals or humane professionals are brought into the home on an animal cruelty call, they should keep their eyes out for, how do the children look? How do other vulnerable people in the home look? How do they look physically? What is their behavior like? These are very important things to keep your eyes out and to cross-refer to different professionals. Again, going back to this iceberg idea, if you're seeing signs of one type of violence, it's more than likely that these other forms of violence are going to be there as well, because the correlation, research shows, everything shows that this correlation is statistically very significant, that these are co-occurring in families. And another way to sort of keep this in your mind is to talk to colleagues about it. So one of my favorite parts of doing these presentations is that people often come up to me afterwards and say, this is such an obvious idea, but I have never thought of it before. And that's exactly how I felt before I first learned about this link and the link research. And it really stuck with me. I mean, I learned about it sort of 20 years ago, but it really stuck with me because it is such a straightforward, common sense idea. But for many of us, we haven't sort of connected those dots yet. So I get really excited when people hear these webinars, attend these webinars, and then talk to their colleagues about this idea of the link. And again, a graphic like the one I have here, which is this sort of, I believe it's a Venn diagram, which is the circles. Sharing a very simple graphic like that can really make a difference in terms of reminding people to keep their eyes open for all the different types of violence that might be occurring. And the last thing I would say is to include information about the link in your training and in your educational materials. So one of our hopes is that with the Toronto Police, we can include information about the link in the police college curriculum. But also we're working with the Ontario Veterinary Medical Association to train veterinarians on this issue and to include that in veterinary medical colleges, which is, you know, difficult to do. But these are some of our hopes that moving forward, this research will make its way into sort of a broader spectrum of curriculums and, again, silos of different types of work. So we have, let me see here, we have about 15 minutes left, so that leaves some decent time for questions if people have any questions. I'm going to leave you with a few resources here. And again, perhaps these are all Google. If you go to Google Scholar, you can just enter this and they come up as PDFs, which is nice. So these are just some great resources. And I would really encourage you to visit the National Link Coalition website. It's for the states, but it really is kind of a clearinghouse of information. And it's broken down by different professions. So child protection professionals can click on a link and find information specifically relevant to what you do. Same with domestic violence, same with elder abuse and things like that. So I would encourage you to take a look at those. And now I think I'll open it up for questions if there are any. So just one second. Yeah. Perfect. Thanks. Okay. And I would also check there because sometimes. Okay, so it might take you a few minutes just to type your questions, but I'm going to keep an eye out here and see. But in the meantime, again, I would direct you to the National Link Coalition website and also to our own website, which is Link Coalition Toronto. It's just linktoronto.org. We do have some resources there, but we also have some information on programs like the SafePet program throughout Canada. And I'll just take a moment to say again that our hope is to expand this program throughout Ontario. We've had many conversations with people throughout Canada who are hoping to start something similar in their own region. So it's something we're currently working on with the Ontario Veterinary Medical Association. And our hope is to sort of move our way north as we go on to do this. So as you can imagine, there's different sort of challenges as you go to different environments. As you move to more rural areas, the type of animals that we would be fostering would oftentimes include farm animals and things like that. So right now in Toronto, we're mainly fostering cats and dogs, but we'll kind of take anything. As you go north, there's different things to consider primarily, which is the types of animals you're fostering, farm animals, but also questions about confidentiality and safety come up much more. So in Toronto, we take great pains to place our animals, our foster dogs, in neighborhoods that are far away from where the abuser lives and works. In rural areas, however, it can be hard to hide an animal, right? Because everyone tends to know everyone, and it's harder to maintain that confidentiality. I see someone here saying that Yukon Kona's coalition does amazing work in Yukon Territory. So that's really exciting to know, actually. I might write that down because I'm guessing they might do work around the link or around SafePet, which is really exciting. So I'll take a look at that. Just looking for any questions here. Just one second. Okay, good. So here's one question from Kristen Chambers. It says, are women able to visit their pets while in foster placements through SafePet? I have referred women here, but that is the question I've been asked, and that's a really good question. For our program, no. And for most of the programs I know of, women cannot visit their pets while they're in foster care. The reasons for that, again, are primarily safety and confidentiality. So we don't want our fosters and our clients ever to meet each other. We don't want anyone going to each other's homes. Also, we don't want to potentially lead an abuser to a shelter where the address isn't known publicly. So we don't allow it, but we do provide updates. We provide photos and updates to our clients. We try and do it at least once a month. And oftentimes, anytime a client emails us, we'll give them a quick update on how their pets are doing. Interestingly enough, we've also had clients say that they're in a way relieved they can't see their pet while it's in fostering, because they need time just to focus on themselves. As you can imagine, they've gone through quite a bit of trauma. And for them, it's actually comforting to know that their pet is in a safe space, their pet's calm and being loved for and cared for, but that's not something they have to take on themselves right now, which has been really interesting, actually. At one point, we were considering having like some sort of way where we could bring pets to the shelter or something for women to visit with them. But ultimately, we thought that that would actually be extremely stressful for the animals themselves, because they'd see their owner, they'd go nuts, they'd run around, oh my God, it's my owner, yay. But then we'd have to take them away again. And I think that that's, hard for everyone involved, including the pets. So we haven't done that at this point. Okay, another question. Are you aware of any programs in Nova Scotia? And are you able to share your presentation and contact information? Let me ask Pearl about that. Certainly my contact information. So feel free to anyone here to email me. The email address is info, I-N-F-O, at linktoronto.org. So just L-I-N-K Toronto all together, .org. I'm always happy to answer questions. That's why we love doing presentations like this. As for any programs in Nova Scotia, go to our website, linktoronto.org, and I believe we have a program listed, but if we don't, send me an email, because I think there's something happening in Nova Scotia, but I'm not totally well versed on it. So that's a really good question, and let me follow up on that. Because I know, actually, it's really interesting. There's a ton of interest in the East for SafePet programs and for Link stuff. There's a lot happening in Alberta, and there's a lot happening in BC and Vancouver, obviously, because BC is always sort of ahead of everyone. But the East Coast, there's definitely stuff happening there. So that's let me definitely follow up on that.
And also download, if she has about the presentation,
yep,
it can be downloaded right from there. And if they have trouble doing it, just email me and I'll send it.
Okay, awesome. So Pearl just said, and I think I see others saying in here, that you can download the documents in the document tab. And the two papers I referred to you can always just email me and I'll send them to you. But again, I've listed them at the end of the presentation. You can just Google them on Google Scholar and they'll come up. So just looking for more questions here. Okay, so I don't see any other questions right now. Sorry?
If something comes to mind, they can email me and I'll forward them to you.
Yeah, so definitely. So I would say if you have any questions, if anything comes to mind after we're done here today, feel free to email Pearl at Boost, or feel free to email me. So again, my email address is info@linktoronto.org. I encourage you to email about anything whatsoever. We love spreading word about this, and we love helping people get programs like this started. And if I don't know the answer, I will definitely send you to someone who does. It's a very sort of tight-knit and interesting thing, and we're really seeing interest in the link growing in Canada, which is really exciting. There's also, for those of you that might be interested in, there's something called the National Violence Link Conference, I believe. It has a very sort of awkward name, but it's a really great conference. It's organized by Humane Canada. The last one was in Toronto, maybe 6 months ago, and we presented there. It's all types of professionals that work with families. It's police, children's aid, domestic violence, lawyers, veterinarians. It's pretty incredible, and it's everyone coming together to present on and talk about this issue. And the nice thing about it was in Ottawa before that. The nice thing about it is that, as you know, I'm sure, it's very easy to get burned out talking and thinking about this sad stuff all the time. The great thing about the conference is that I found it really energizing. So it's a great way to sort of do professional development, learn new things, stuff you might not have thought about, but it's also just a really nice way to connect with people that are researching things that are of interest to you and to make connections across silos to work together to sort of solve this problem. So again, I encourage you to look that up. It's the National Violence Link Conference, I believe, the Canadian Violence Link Conference, sorry. So I might leave it there. And I encourage you to email me anytime. And I really appreciate you attending this webinar. And I hope you enjoyed it. So thank you.